Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel, and welcome to today's video in which I'm going to be talking about Edgar Allan Poe. I am going to be talking a little bit about his life, but I'm also going to be analyzing his famous poem The Raven. So Poe is one of the most famous writers out there. He's referenced in so many different popular culture aspects, such as in movies, TV shows, in books, in songs, you name it. There are different poetry contests going on in today's world where people gather to read his poetry. He's also well known for his mystery genre and his short stories. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about his life first, because I personally never knew anything about him before. And then once I got to study a little bit, I was surprised because his life is very tragic and depressing, and it's no wonder that he wrote work and poems with such a dark and gothic themes. So Edgar Allan Poe was born on January 19th, 1809 in Boston, and he grew up in a foster family because his mother passed away when he was just a little kid, and his father abandoned the family, but he also died soon after that. Edgar grew up in this foster family, but he didn't necessarily have the best relationship with them. In 1815, when he was just like 6 years old, his foster family moved to the United Kingdom, and then like 5 years later they came back to the US and they settled in Richmond, Virginia. And there in Virginia, Edgar was accepted to the University of Virginia, university where he wanted to study modern and ancient languages, but unfortunately he didn't necessarily have the best luck with college, and it's supposedly because he, as I mentioned, he didn't really have the best relationship with his foster father, and he wasn't giving Edgar that much money. So it's probably because of that Edgar started gambling soon after he got into college, and quickly he obtained a lot of gambling debts, and that led him to drop out of college just a year after. But not only that, Edgar also discovered around that time that the woman he was engaged to, she married another man, and that just broke Edgar's heart. He was very depressed, and he started just looking for the jobs. He was working as a clerk, he was working at different small jobs in like publishing and writing. He was working as a newspaper writer, he was working as a clerk. So he was just gathering those like small jobs, trying to distract himself supposedly. And then later that year, 1827, he joined the United States Army, and it wasn't really the best deal for him because he was just serving there for just like $5 a month. But that was around the time when he released his first book, and it was called Tamerlane and Other Poems, but it was very unsuccessful. It sold just 50 copies, and basically just no one wanted to read that book. Edgar didn't have that much influence and no one really knew him. So in 1829, Edgar was discharged from the army, and he started writing much more around that time period. And in 1831, Poe released his poetry book. It was just called Poems. And I also read that his like army friends helped him to fund that book, because around 1830, around that year, it was very hard for the American writers to get published, because as I understand, there was this publishing houses, like publishing industries were focusing more on the translated literature or the literature from the UK. There wasn't like the best financial situation in the country, so they didn't really want to invest in any aspiring American writers. So it was very hard for Poe to get published, and he was just trying his best. He released his second book, Poems, by himself with the help of his friends, and it was still kind of unsuccessful, even though he already started to get noticed by different literary critics, and it was like the start of his career where like people would recognize him more. But unfortunately, around that time, Poe started having drinking problems, and that led him to lose some of his jobs. And soon after, realizing that his publishing career has turned out to be not as successful as he probably thought it would be. Around that time, he just started taking more jobs like an editor, critic, a literary reviewer. He started working like in the publishing houses just because he needed money to live, and the money that he got from his previous unsuccessful book releases, those money, it wasn't sufficient to support him and to survive. Basically, he just needed jobs that would pay him. As I said, it was very, very hard for any American writer at that time to have a career and have money from that career that will help them to support themselves. And Poe, unfortunately, was one of those writers who wasn't recognized, and the money that he was getting wasn't enough to sustain his life. Around 1835, Poe's life started to change a little bit. He married his cousin, Virginia, who was significantly younger than him. Poe was like 26 and she was just 13 years old, and even though it wasn't really a big problem for people to marry their cousins who were younger, or like younger people, it was still kind of not really supported by everyone. So Poe and his wife Virginia, who was also his cousin, they moved to Richmond, where he continued to work and trying to write more and trying to release his own work. And one of the Poe's very significant jobs at that time that he obtained, it was working at Graham magazine. He was working in that publishing industry, and that magazine was very, very successful. It was very popular, and it actually also encouraged Poe to start working at his own magazine, but I'm not sure if he ever even started his own magazine. I just know that that position at the Graham magazine was very, very successful, and it brought him a lot of fame. He was recognized by critics, by the editors, but unfortunately, after like 2 years, he left that job, and supposedly that was because of his drinking problems, and he just got burned out very quickly. Poe also released The Raven in 1845. And I'm gonna be talking about The Raven a little bit later in this video. In 1849, Poe's wife Virginia died, and that affected him so much. He was depressed. He was writing a lot of like depressing stuff around that time, and one of his like well-known sayings by Poe is that there can be anything more beautiful than the death of a young woman. He actually said it because he witnessed his mother's death and his wife's death, and they died both at a relatively young age, and Poe was left alone, and he wrote a lot of depressing and like dark stuff because he witnessed that. And you know, after a while he kind of got back up. He started being sober again, and he wanted to marry another woman, but unfortunately when he was on his way to Baltimore, he stopped at Philadelphia, and that was when he disappeared. He first disappeared for 5 days. No one could find him. No one heard about him. He was found after those 5 days. He was found in a very, very rough condition. He was delirious. He couldn't really speak anything. No one understood what he was trying to say to them. He was in a very, very bad condition, and he died soon after. And people to this day don't know like the real reason why he died. A lot of the theories exist about it, but the official cause of Poe's death is brain swelling, but a lot of people say that it was actually because he was drinking that much. And also there was this thing back in the 1800s and late 1800s. It was called cooping, and it was electoral fraud where some of the people who were kind of influential, they would find random, often homeless people just like on the street, and they would somehow like force them to go and vote for the person that they wanted, and they would treat those people very, very badly. They would like beat them, and they would do that like several times. So it's very likely that Poe was one of the victims of that cooping electoral fraud thing that existed back then. But yeah, no one really knows what the real reason is. So yeah, as you saw, Poe's life was very tragic. He witnessed a lot of depressing stuff in his life, and he was treated by other people very badly. No one really believes in him, and even his own family, like he grew up in a foster family, and those people didn't really like him and they didn't really care about him that much. So he was feeling alone a lot of the times, and that is like obviously reflected in his writing. So now I'm going to be talking about Poe's one of his most famous poem, The Raven, and I'm sure that a lot of people have heard about this poem. Poe released his poem The Raven in 1845, and it quickly became very, very successful. As I just told you guys before, no one really knew him. He didn't really have that much influence. After he released The Raven, a lot of people discovered him, and it just became like this popular culture phenomena of that time. This poem is kind of very straightforward. There's no like hidden meanings or anything that other poets would have, like Emily Dickinson, for example. Raven is just like straightforward. When you hear that poem, when you read it, you know exactly what happens, and there's like no that much to interpret. Obviously every single person will like interpret that differently and will find their own meaning from that poem, but still it's kind of like straightforward. So that was the reason why so many people, even back in 1830s, resonated with that poem so much, because they could understand what actually was going on. Basically, there's like one character in that poem, and that character has lost a beloved one, and he's in this very bad, depressed condition. The entire poem kind of centers around the love and grief, and the raven is the symbol of death. The poem is very like, what's interesting about this poem is that it's very rhythmic and it reads like a song. So if you have seen any like performances of this poem, it really is like a story and like a song in one. It includes different literary devices such as alliteration and interval and rhyme, so I'm gonna be talking about that a little bit later. We first meet the main character. He's alone in his room. It's like December, it's very cold night. He's alone in his room. He about to like fall asleep, but something wakes him up, and it's a strange noise from somewhere outside. So he gets up to check what that was. When he checks the door, no one's there. When he goes and checks the window, there's this like big raven that flies into his room, and it sits on like a Greek sculpture that he has in his room. And when the main character asks the raven what's the raven's name, Raven, to his surprise, answers, and the only word that the raven will ever say in his poem is nevermore. He doesn't say anything else. The main character talks to the raven and he expects him to talk something back. He becomes more and more like angry and anxious as the poem progresses. So the entire like plot of that poem is that the further we get, the more angry and upset and anxious the main character is, but the raven kind of stays still, and the only thing that he says is nevermore. This poem is kind of like it starts and gradually we are introduced to the more and more of the stress. So as the poem progresses, we as readers or as people who hear the poem, we become more and more anxious, and that's because Poe uses the literary devices here that I'm going to be talking about now. So I don't know that much about literary devices, but this poem is written in trochaic octameter, and it means that the rhyme scheme of this poem is ABCBBB. So I'm gonna put a little like picture of the poem on the screen so you guys can see what I mean. So the end words of each and every line is like very, then we get lore, tapping, and then door and door and more is kind of repeated, so it rhymes. Very corresponds to A, lore is B, tapping is C, and so very, lore, tapping, and then door, door, and more correspond to lore. So that's the rhyme scheme of the poem, and the poem is it also has internal rhyme. So for example, the word once upon a midnight dreary, while ponder weekend weary. So dreary and weary, those two words rhyme. And then we get while I nodded nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping. So napping and tapping also rhyme. So that's the internal rhyme scheme of this poem. The whole poem kind of follows this pattern, and it's very interesting how complex this poem is in terms of like composition and like all of these literary devices, but at the same time this poem is kind of pretty straightforward. As I said before, the poem sets a very dark and anxious mood. Poe really, what I like about this poem personally is that Poe really creates this straightforward narrative that doesn't really require us to like think that much about the poem and to like analyze every single word and every single sentence and look for like different meanings there and like references to something. He just paints a straightforward picture of what's going on. So I think I'm gonna be ending this video right here. Thank you so much for watching this video. I definitely want to check out more Poe's like other poems and his short stories, so I think I'm gonna be doing that on the winter break. I also would like to make more videos like this about other poets or writers. Just let me know what writer I should read next. Leave that in the comments, and yeah, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll see you soon. Bye.